This is the video lecture for Lesson 20 in Clayton Croy's A Primer to Biblical Greek. This lesson is full of information regarding participles, including the forms for the aorist passive participle, perfect participles, and several different translations, including periphrastic participles and other nuances in translation. Remember again that participles are verbal adjectives. That means they have both characteristics of verbs and characteristics of adjectives. You'll recall that we've learned that there are two basic functions of participles. They can have an adverbial function when they tell us something about the circumstances of the main verb, and they can have adjectival functions. That is, they modify a noun or a pronoun in a sentence. And we've learned several forms already. We've learned the present active and present middle passive participles, the present forms of a, me as well, and finally the aorist active and middle participles. The first new form that you'll learn is the aorist passive participle. This participle is based off of the aorist passive indicative with some slight changes. So the first thing that you want to look for with aorist passive participles is the theta epsilon infix throughout. This is the marker of the aorist passive participle. The endings of the masculine and neuter participles will be similar to third declension nouns with an unt infix, except in the third person plural. The endings of feminine nouns will resemble first declension nouns like doxa and doxes. They will have no augment, just like aorist active and aorist middle forms. The aorist passive participle denotes undefined, simple action that is prior to the main verb, although there are times when it will also denote action that is simultaneous to the action of the main verb. Here are the forms of the aorist passive participle. What I've tried to show you with this chart are the distinctive markers or the things to be looking out for. And the first thing that you will be looking out for is that theta epsilon, which you can see in the pink color throughout this chart. And then to that, you'll see the nt ending in all but the masculine nominative singular and the masculine neuter singular. But after that, you see the infix nu, tau throughout. And then these endings that we've come to recognize, which are the third declension nouns. And you'll notice with the feminine singular forms, you have the theta epsilon as well. And then you actually have the sigma again that we've come to recognize with the aorist tense. And then the endings follow those of doxa, doxes. And so you can see in the red font the consistent endings that we've begun to recognize with those feminine forms, as well as those endings that we have expected with the masculine and the neuter forms. Here are the forms of the aorist passive participle in the plural. Once again, you can see the nt infix on the masculine and the neuter, and here you can see that the dative plural for both the masculine and the neuter is highlighted because it doesn't have that nt infix. But the red font shows you that these are the standard endings that we've come to expect with third declension nouns. And then the feminine plural forms, after the sigma, you have these endings that are very, very familiar to us at this point from first declension nouns. And so, once again, the things we're looking out for are that theta epsilon, the unt infix for masculine and neuter participles. Please be aware that luthenta can be identical in the masculine singular accusative, as we saw in the last chart, or in the neuter plural nominative, the neuter plural accusative, and the neuter plural vocative. Another form that we'll learn in this lesson is the perfect active participle. And so again, let's begin with what we're looking for. As with the perfect active indicative, you will be looking for both reduplication and the kappa infix. These are sort of our standard markers of the perfect tense. The endings of the masculine and neuter are similar to third declension nouns, but the nu in the nu tau infix drops out. So you'll just have a tau there. But the endings are very similar to what we just saw with the aorist passive participle. The endings of the feminine nouns are very similar to first declension nouns. These are pure eta nouns, if you'll remember that from way back when. So you'd be thinking about hora, horas as an example of the endings for the perfect active participles that are feminine gender. And the perfect active participle denotes completed action with a continuing result. Here are the forms of the perfect active participle. And you can see, based on the different colors throughout this chart, that I've tried to call attention to those aspects of the perfect active participle that you really want to be looking for or paying attention to. And you'll see that in all cases we have the reduplication le in front of the stem, and that we have the kappa infix throughout. And then you'll see that for the feminine singular endings, these follow the pattern exactly of hora, horas. And so we should begin to recognize these. This isn't a matter of learning new forms. It's simply a matter of applying previous knowledge to these new forms. And then you'll see that the masculine and the neuter are a bit more difficult or maybe original compared to the feminine singular. But once again, in the red font, you'll see that these are endings that we've come to recognize because of third declension nouns. And I've kept that tau there in the brown font to remind you that this is similar to that nt infix, the new tau infix that we've seen in previous verb forms of the participle. Here are the forms of the perfect active participle in the plural forms. And once again, you'll notice in the pink font that you have the reduplication in front of the stem and the kappa consistently throughout. And now in the masculine and the neuter forms, the endings are very similar to what we've come to see in third declension nouns and on other participial forms that are based on third declension nouns. And for the feminine plural column, you can see that these are exactly the sorts of endings that we would expect from first declension nouns like hora. And so again, really you just need to be able to see these distinctive features and begin to parse or translate them accordingly. This is our last new form that we'll learn in this lecture. It's the perfect middle passive participle. These forms will have reduplication, which is the singular marker of the perfect tense in this case. There is no kappa as we saw with the other perfect participles. Like other middle passive forms, however, there will be the infix men throughout. And so the endings that are added onto that infix are similar to second declension nouns like lagos and ergon. And then the endings of the feminine forms are like first declension nouns like phone. And as with the perfect active participle, perfect middle passive participles denote completed action that have a continuing result or a continuing effect. So here are the forms of the perfect middle passive participle. Once again, you can see the presence of reduplication in front of the stem throughout. You can see the infix men throughout. And then the endings for masculine, feminine, and neuter singular forms are identical to what we've become very confident in recognizing with second and first declension nouns. And so there are no sort of exceptions or variants here. These are all very similar as long as we're able to break down the component parts of these forms. And so your brain's going to sort of want to shut down when you see a form like this because it's so long and it seems to have so many component parts. But if you just slow down and break out the reduplication, the men infix, and then the various endings, you should have no trouble analyzing these in the exercises. Just a small note that lelumenon is identical for the masculine singular accusative as well as the neuter singular nominative and the neuter singular accusative. Here are the forms of the perfect middle passive participle in the plural. Once again, nothing terribly surprising here. We have the reduplication before the stem, the men infix, and then the endings that we would expect for first and second declension nouns. Once again, no exceptions, nothing terribly surprising. It's just a matter of being able to break down these forms so that we can recognize them when we see them in the exercises or in the Greek New Testament. All right, so the first sort of addition to the use of participles concerns the periphrastic use, or what are known as periphrastic participles. Essentially, these are the combination of a me, the verb to be, and a participle. So they're very similar to what we would see in English as I was teaching. In Greek, we might say emen didaskon. You can see the combination of a me, the first person singular form, with the masculine singular nominative participle didaskon. These are most often used as substitutes for the imperfect and perfect tenses. And for more examples and translations, see section 141 in the textbook. Essentially, this shouldn't throw you off entirely. It's something that you're used to seeing in English, and it should be relatively straightforward in the Greek. Finally, there are a few more nuances that we might want to add to adverbial participles. Remember that our adverbial participles express some circumstance related to the main verb. There are different nuances that depend on context, entirely on context, not on the participle itself. So that is to say, it's not the form of the participle or the tense of the participle that matters. It's just the context. And sometimes there are adverbs or particles, other aspects of the sentence that give us clues, but really it's just context. And in fact, it's a matter of interpretation, at least sometimes. And so some of these adverbial participle nuances include time. So we might translate this as while, or even after, if we can denote sort of when the action was taking place. We can have a nuance that denotes manner. So the manner in which something is done, or the manner in which something is said. We might also have an adverbial participle that denotes by. So by turning in his homework, the student completed his assignment. That would be something like the nuance denoted by means. You can also have cause, which we would translate before the verb that is the participial form, because. And there is also a conditional, sort of if. And finally, you can have what is known as concession, which is although. And so you can always use the vanilla ing ending if in doubt. And so it's really important for you to know that these are things to be aware of, and these are possibilities for translating adverbial participles. But what's most important is that first you're able to recognize that it is an adverbial participle rather than an adjectival participle. And second, that you can begin to compare English translations, because some of the English translations are going to bring out a nuance in the participle that is based on the context, that is open to interpretation. And so that might be a place where you, as somebody teaching or preaching on a text from the New Testament, might want to differ or nuance or interpret that participle in a different way. All right, so let's get started with the first practice and review exercise from lesson 20. Edexamen ta dora ta hagiasthenta, kai enenka auta diaton thuron tu hieru. As is the case, I want to start by finding the simple sentence. And so we have one prepositional phrase that we can sort of blot out for now, diaton thuron, and then tu hieru is a genitive phrase that modifies thuron. And so we can bracket that whole phrase out. And so we are left with endexamen ta dora ta hagiasthenta kai enenka auta. And from there, we want to identify the participles, because that's really the focus of these last few lessons. And we have one participle, hagiasthenta. And as you can see, I've done my best to sort of bring out the component parts that you would be interested in looking at. You see the theta epsilon, which is a marker of the aorist passive participle. And then you see the unt infix and the alpha ending. And so that denotes a plural accusative. And remember, it could either be neuter or accusative, but in this case, it's most likely going to be the accusative. And that's especially clear because of the definite article that is in front of it, which also is our dead giveaway that we have an adjectival participle. So somehow ta hagiasthenta is modifying ta dora, which is also neuter plural accusative and is the direct object of the verb edexamen. And so with that in mind, we can begin, or we can move towards a translation, which we would translate this something like, I received the gifts that had been sanctified, and I brought them through the doors of the temple. And so you'll see that we would parse edexamen as aorist deponent indicative, first singular from dechomai. Remember, dechomai is one of these verbs that has a middle passive ending, but has an active meaning, I receive. And then enenka is our other finite verb that we would parse as aorist active indicative, first singular from pharaoh. And you'll recall that this was one of the vocabulary words that we memorized. It's one of the sort of odd aorist forms that is related to the verb pharaoh. And the final thing that we might point out is that auta there is a pronoun, and it's a neuter plural accusative pronoun, and its antecedent, the word that it stands in for, is ta dora, the gifts. That is the end of the lecture for lesson 20. I know a lot of ground was covered in this lesson, but I want to encourage you again that we're simply beginning to train ourselves to look for distinctive parts of these participles so that we can then begin to translate and analyze them accordingly. Thank you very much for your attention.